Alright class, let's talk about who gets the money, which is a worksheet that applies all of your Punnett squares. Now this background information tells us about Mr. and Mrs. Jones, who died tragically in an accident, and they did have a mysterious son, but he ran away a long time ago. Well, when they found out that there was a huge inheritance left by Mr. and Mrs. Jones, 5 men came out of the woodworks, and they all are claiming to be the long-lost son. So we're going to use basic Punnett squares, which we have all practiced, to figure out if any of these 5 men could actually be the son of Mr. and Mrs. Jones. So we start with part 1, which is monohybrid crosses. These are our simple complete dominance crosses, where remember any capital letter masks a lowercase. And we're looking at 2 traits at first. We're looking at brown eyes and we're looking at blue eyes, but we're also looking at earlobes, free earlobes or attached. Now brown is dominant to blue, so I'm going to make sure that I have a capital B anytime there's brown, lowercase b for the blue allele. For free earlobes, that's dominant, so I'm going to do capital E for free earlobes, lowercase e for attached. And when it asks you, and it'll ask you to do this in the other parts too, it's going to say in the space below, draw 2 Punnett squares showing the possible offspring of Mr. and Mrs. Jones for eye color and earlobes. So you want to make 2 sections. You should probably make an eye color section and an ear color section. And we need to figure out the genotypes for Mr. and Mrs. Jones so we can make Punnett squares for them. So let's start with eye color. Mr. Jones is homozygous brown-eyed. Remember, brown eyes is for capital B and homo means same, so we know that Mr. Jones is big B, big B. And we know that Mrs. Jones here is heterozygous brown-eyed. Hetero means different, but at least one big and one little. So we know that she has this genotype here. Then what you're going to do is you're going to fill out a Punnett square where you put dad on top, mom on the side, figure out what possible genotypes go in the center there. You'll do the same thing for ear type 2. So Mr. and Mrs. Jones are both heterozygous for ears, which means big and little letters. So both of them are big E, little e. So then you make a Punnett square for that too, and you figure out what their possible offspring genotypes for ears would be. Now moving on to the next step here, the very next step is for you to figure out which person's genotype is actually possible. So that means you're going to have to go back and look at this chart again. So we know Mr. and Mrs. Jones already. We know their genotypes because we figured them out up here. So we know for eye color, Mr. Jones is big B, big B. And we know that Mrs. Jones is big B, little b. And we know for earlobes that they were both heterozygous, so that's big E, big E, little e. But now we need to look at everybody else. So you'll look at Carl. He's homozygous brown-eyed and has attached earlobes. So we know what homozygous brown-eyed is. It's 2 big B's. But for his earlobes, he has attached earlobes. Well, attached is recessive. You can't have any capital letters for attached earlobes, so he's little e, little e. So you're going to do that all the way down, and then the very last question is which men can be eliminated. So what that means is once you figure out what the parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jones, could have had, and you compare that to what genotypes the men have, you should be able to delete at least one of these men as being possible children, and you'll explain that down here. You're going to do the same thing for the codominance and incomplete dominance problems. Now, I'm going to give you some letters to use. We're going to use A and B are codominant over blood type O. So you're going to use a capital A. You can use a capital B or a lowercase o. RH positive is dominant over RH negative. This is actually just completely dominant, and you can actually just use pluses and minuses, but the plus is dominant over minus. And for hair texture, it actually gives you letters to use. You're going to do the same thing here that you did on the first section, so you probably want to separate all of your stuff by blood type, RH factor, and then by hair texture, and then you can do your Punnett squares, figure out the genotypes that each of these people do have, and figure out who can be eliminated. And then the same thing on the back side, except now they're doing vision tests for sex-linked color blindness. So in this case here, I want you to use X and capital N if they have normal vision, and I want you to use X lowercase n if they have color blindness, okay? And remember, males are XY, females are XX. So each of the females has to have a certain kind of N, and, well, only Mrs. Jones. And then each of the males has to have an X with a letter next to it as well to say whether they're colorblind or not. And then you will figure out who gets the money based on that. I hope this was helpful. Please email me if you have any questions.